By dawn on October 20, 1962, 20,000 well-supplied Chinese assault troops were in position along the Himalayan border. Their target was the Thagla Ridge, held by a freezing, isolated force of just 600 Indian defenders. 1,000 miles away in New Delhi, the political establishment was completely detached from this reality. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru calmly departed for an official visit to Ceylon, assuring the press that his army had clear instructions to throw the Chinese out. The terrain itself dictated the terms of this conflict. On the northern side of the disputed frontier, Chinese forces operated with all-weather roads and troops drawn from native populations, fully accustomed to the altitude. The southern approach for the Indian Army offered no modern roads at all. Indian troops, largely conscripts pulled from the plains, needed weeks of slow acclimatization. Instead, they were rushed up to these steep peaks, completely cut off from the ground. Every piece of food, clothing, and equipment had to be dropped in from the air. The physical geography heavily favored the Chinese military. Yet, in the Indian capital, political leaders issued threats that ignored the physical reality of the terrain their soldiers were standing on. To justify sending men into these impossible conditions, Indian military intelligence relied on a convenient assumption. Planners in Delhi reasoned that if India could only manage to maintain a small brigade in the harsh weather, China must face the exact same limitation. In reality, 2 full Chinese divisions were waiting. Frontline commanders could see the Chinese buildup. Brigadier J.P. Dalvi, commanding the 7th Infantry Brigade, bombarded his headquarters with warnings, detailing the extreme weakness of his position and the imminent danger of massive retaliation. Those warnings were ignored. Military intelligence, led by Chief of Staff General B.M. Kaul, blithely advised the government that China would never risk a major war against India. On the ground, Dalvi's men were barely surviving. Due to the severe difficulty of supplying them with food by air, the normal brigade complement of 3,500 troops had been reduced to 2,400. They hadn't carried out a single military maneuver since 1959. Instead, they spent their days as laborers, collecting wood at 14,000 feet just to build their own shelters. By mid-October, the Indian High Command had internalized a version of reality that bore no resemblance to the reports coming from the border. For the planners in Delhi, maintaining this illusion was the only way to answer the complaints from their frontline commanders. Determined to force the issue, Nehru publicly announced that the Chinese troops must be removed. To ensure his instructions were followed, General Kaul, a staff officer with 0 combat command experience, was sent directly to the front. Arriving at the border, Kaul ignored the pleas of his local commanders. Accused of stalling by his political bosses, he ordered an advance on October 10th, the last date permitted in his instructions from Delhi. The order required a tiny, isolated Indian force of just 50 men to push past the Chinese positions and, quote, sit behind them. The response was absolute. A Chinese force 800 strong reacted by instantly wiping out the small Indian detachment. Witnessing the slaughter, General Kaul was stunned. He turned to Dalvi and said, "Oh my God, you are right. They mean business." The Indian strategy relied on the assumption that China would not fight back. That bluff shattered the moment it collided with a prepared military opponent. Even if they had the numbers, Dalvi's forces were doomed by their own supply chain. Parachuting food and equipment proved highly unreliable, with 75% of the loads drifting directly into Chinese-held territory. Of the crates that actually landed on the Indian side, up to 40% were ruined on impact. To save money, the military was reusing old parachutes that had rotted in the open and frequently ripped or failed to open. Essential heating oil was dropped in massive 44-gallon drums that the exhausted men couldn't haul out of the heavy snow. The troops lacked proper winter clothing. Their boots, supplied only in sizes 6 and 12, lacked studs, and the rubber soles simply perished in the freezing weather. As his men succumbed to pulmonary disorders and frostbite, Brigadier Dalvi received an irate message from divisional headquarters. They formally reprimanded him for failing to send a team of athletes to compete in the Sidi Barani celebrations. By October 18th, the leadership structure collapsed. General Kaul succumbed to altitude sickness and fled to a hospital in Delhi, leaving behind no deputy. He attempted to command the doomed brigade by telephone, 1,000 miles from the front. Before the Chinese even launched their main offensive, the Indian 7th Infantry Brigade had already been crippled by its own geography and an incompetent supply chain. The Chinese commanders had seen enough. Irritated by Nehru's talk of throwing them out, they decided to deliver a tangible demonstration of India's hopeless position. Just before dawn on October 20th, a massive artillery barrage lit up the Himalayas. 150 Chinese guns opened fire on the ridge. The 600 Indian defenders were completely swept aside by the assault. Those who survived the bombardment were killed or taken into captivity. There was no prolonged engagement. The battle was over almost the moment it began, the inevitable result of throwing an exhausted, poorly armed fraction of a brigade against 20,000 assault troops. The support troops arriving at the ridge only added to the tragedy. Exhausted from the climb and suffering from altitude sickness, they were armed with single-shot rifles and just pouch ammunition. Lacking axes or machetes, they tried to cut down trees for shelter using shovels, much to the amusement of the watching Chinese. In New Delhi, false confidence evaporated into panic. The Indian government desperately called on Britain and the United States for military aid. But just as suddenly as they attacked, the leadership in Beijing called a halt to hostilities and withdrew. They had made their point. The destruction of the 7th Brigade was the final result of a system that prioritized political rhetoric over physical logistics. Dalby's men were sent to the ridge by a government that had spent years convincing itself that its opponent would never dare to act. The collapse at Namku raises a question for any military hierarchy. What happens to a frontline force when its commanders are given intelligence designed to flatter the pre-existing beliefs of their leaders, rather than describe the enemy?